Good morning and welcome to this special conference edition of our speaker series, Safe at Home at the Center for a New American Security. I'm Carrie Cordero. The Safe at Home series is intended to bring greater attention to the safety and security issues that affect Americans on a daily basis. As democracy is under strain in many parts of the world, it's important that we regularly and persistently highlight how democracy delivers for people in their daily lives. And I was enlightened to hear Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor, just in his conversation preceding ours with CEO Richard Fontaine, talk about this exact concept of democracy delivering for people. One of the things that it has to deliver is a reasonable degree of safety and security. And so in this series so far, we've been talking about political violence against government officials, pandemic preparedness and response, climate-related emergency management. Later this year in the series, we're going to host a discussion on the legislative and policy developments to reduce the threat of mass shootings and gun violence across the country. And this series is going to continue to dive deep into the efforts that policymakers, leaders, and operators at the federal level and all across the country are engaging in to protect the country consistent with our laws and values. Today, we're discussing terrorism and domestic terrorism in particular. And so I'm delighted to welcome Assistant Attorney General for National Security, Matt Olsen, to the conversation. Matt, welcome.
Thanks, Carrie. Great to be here with you and everybody.
I want to give you a few words, give our audience a few words about Assistant Attorney General Olsen's background and the experience and knowledge that he brings to his role as Assistant Attorney General. He leads the National Security Division of the Justice Department, whose mission is to combat terrorism, espionage, cybercrime, and other threats to national security. He previously served as the director of the National Counterterrorism Center and was also the general counsel of the NSA, the National Security Agency. For 18 years, Matt worked as a career attorney in the Justice Department, as a prosecutor, and in a wide array of leadership positions in the national security arena. And in 2006, back when I was at DOJ, he helped establish the National Security Division and served as the first career Deputy Assistant Attorney General for National Security. So he has a long and distinguished experience at the Justice Department and across the national security community, and he brings thoughtfulness and expertise to this conversation. A few notes just of virtual housekeeping today. This conversation is live and is being live streamed on CNAS's website and on our social media channels. On our website, you can enter questions for me and Assistant Attorney General Olsen, and you can also post questions on Twitter using the hashtag CNAS 2022. Our team will make sure that I see the questions, and I'll be looking to incorporate them throughout our conversation. So please don't wait until the end to send in your questions. If you have questions and you want to participate in the conversation, please send them in and we'll work them into the conversation as it makes sense. So Matt, again, welcome. Thank you for taking the time to join us today at the CNAS annual conference. And let's dig in to what the Justice Department, the National Security Division, and the administration are doing to respond to the increased threat from domestic terrorism in particular, and other types of domestic violent extremism that threaten Americans all around the country. Just to set this up, last June, as you know, and so for our audience's information, the National Security Council released the first ever domestic terrorism national strategy. It's the first time any administration has had a specific national strategy totally focused on domestic terrorism and countering domestic violent extremism. Over the course of the last year, the FBI director, the Secretary of Homeland Security, when they have said in public testimony, when they've been in public testimony, they've said that domestic terrorism is actually the #1 threat that they are looking at from a inside the homeland domestic perspective. In your role as Assistant Attorney General for National Security, you've got a bird's eye view to all of the threats, foreign and domestic. So can you give our audience, just to start, a sense of, from where you sit, how do you see the domestic terrorism threat where does it fit into the landscape of all the things that you're seeing?
Yeah, thank you for that broad question to start us off, Carrie. It's great again to be here with you and and to be part of this conference. And as you noted, you and I go back a few years to my time in the Justice Department at the beginning of the National Security Division in 2006, and when you and I worked together on FISA matters, basically, and foreign intelligence collection, and reflecting back on that time, in answer to your question, it is really interesting to think about how much has changed in the terms of the threat landscape. When we were together at the beginning of the National Security Division, when it was started in 2006, the focus really was, first and foremost, international terrorism. We were really all about Al-Qaeda, right? And the threat from Al-Qaeda and other jihadist groups, international terrorism, and how it might affect us inside the United States. In fact, the National Security Division was really born, much like other changes in the government at DHS, the creation of DHS, the creation of the Office of Director of National Intelligence, born of the post 9/11 transformation of the government. So that was the focus when I was in the National Security Division at its beginning. Now, returning to the division several, these years later, in 2021, so I've been here about 8 months. It's remarkable how much the threat landscape has changed. It's really as complex and dynamic as I've seen it in my time working on national security over the past plus 15 years plus. So, of course, we are still focused on international terrorism. Al-Qaeda, ISIS are still part of the landscape and require an unwavering level of attention. The biggest change, though, in terms of terrorism, is this rise in domestic terrorism that we've seen over the past several years. As you noted, the White House issued a national strategy, the first of its kind, focused on domestic terrorism. Actually, 1 year and 1 day ago, yesterday was the 1-year anniversary of that strategy, to really focus a whole of government effort on domestic terrorism. It began, as it should, and as we've learned is needed, with an intelligence assessment by the government and the community about what the domestic terrorism threat landscape looks like, to drive the insights of that strategy, which have multiple pillars. Our focus really within the Justice Department is on disruption. That's where we have tools and authorities that we can bring to bear on the domestic terrorism challenge. So your question is sort of, how do I see the domestic terrorism threat in the constellation of threats that we face? And I'll just put a pin in the idea that, or the reality that we are also dealing, of course, with nation state threats in a way that we haven't over the past 20 years. So that is also a huge focus for us now in the National Security Division. But just in terms of terrorism, the intelligence community has been very clear over the past few years that the greatest threat is from single individuals, lone actors, or small cells who are either inspired by international groups like ISIS or are part of domestic terrorism or domestic violent extremist ideologies. And what we've seen is there's really two driving ideologies. One is racially motivated or ethnically motivated hatred, white supremacist in particular, that has been among the most lethal sources of ideological threats or ideologies that drive the threat. And then anti-government or anti-authoritarian. I think, and the numbers are on the rise in terms of the number of domestic violent extremists that we are facing. In fact, the number of domestic violent extremist cases that the FBI has opened has more than doubled over the past 2 years, just to give you some sense.
Right.
Yeah.
So
go ahead.
let me ask you a follow-up. So in terms of the national strategy, so we've got this new strategy. I've been at a think tank a few years now, so we all love a good strategy and a good policy. But the old operational lawyer in me wants to know, how are we going to operationalize this? The strategy is, we're a year into it now, as you mentioned, year and a day. So can you talk about just a little bit, how in the Justice Department, in the National Security Division, how are you operationalizing that strategy to implement it?
Yeah. So again, like any good strategy, it's got an implementation plan, a strategic implementation plan, a SIP, to those of you in the audience who are planners and have been through this. So with detailed requirements and taskings to all of the agencies who are involved. For us in the Justice Department, one component of it is, I mean, it may sound mundane, but it's really important. That's data collection. It's understanding, to try to inform our understanding of the threat. Like, how many cases do we have? Where are those cases coming from? How are we categorizing those cases? Do we have a rigorous taxonomy for characterizing the nature of the threat? And that's been a big part of what we've done. We've built, to operationalize that, we've built processes, and we've actually dedicated resources in terms of people to the collection and analysis of the data. We actually are working with Homeland Security, of course. We're also working with NCTC in doing that. Understanding that threat is what's the first step in trying to combat it. And also in terms of operationalizing the strategy, we've always handled domestic terrorism cases in the National Security Division. We have a counterterrorism section of about 40 attorneys dedicated to counterterrorism. They do both IT and DT, international and domestic terrorism. But I thought it was necessary to increase our focus on domestic terrorism given the nature of the threat. So I announced earlier this year, and then formally stood up just last month, a dedicated domestic terrorism unit within our counterterrorism section. This group consists of prosecutors. It also consists of some data analysts, and the focus is on a number of facets of the challenge. One is coordinating and in some cases directly being involved in the prosecution of DT cases, building up that expertise around domestic terrorism cases, which tend to bring some unique issues to the fore, particularly around protected activity, First Amendment protected activity, and the like. It's also
so there is a resource. There is a resource and sort of a second share and or a partner with the U.S. Attorney's offices that are bringing these cases.
Exactly, the full range of activities, whether it's full partner or just as a resource. Look, I mean, the reality is, and just to dig into that point, because you're an insider, right? So you understand it, and maybe a lot of the audience does as well, right? How this works. But when it comes to the international terrorism side, we have approval authority over certain charges, like material support to terrorism, and we don't necessarily, and we haven't to date, but we are working toward getting a similar type of a role when it comes to domestic terrorism, for the goal of advancing coordination and consistency in building a national program around domestic terrorism. Mm-hmm. And look, when it comes to domestic terrorism, sometimes those charges are charges that are really the bread and butter of a U.S. Attorney's office. So if you have a domestic violent extremist who commits a weapons violation, or right, say fraud, like those cases, U.S. Attorney's offices know how to prosecute those cases. We're there to help them and support them, but they don't necessarily need main justice involvement to the same degree as you might find on the international terrorism side with a material support charge that involves classified information and a lot of intelligence community equities. But when you talk about cases like January 6th and the complex conspiracy cases and charges involving seditious conspiracy, for example, these are really complicated charges. They do involve national level equities. It is important, and in fact, we are directly involved in working closely with the DC U.S. Attorney's Office in that massive investigation and prosecution. So that's a little bit of some bureaucratic insight into to your question about how we're operationalizing this. But the DT unit will be exactly as you would imagine in terms of it will be involved in prosecutions, but it will also be involved in training and guidance, sort of classic main justice role, as well as supporting the data collection and analysis that will help us better understand the nature of the threat.
Great. I want to come back to a little bit later in our discussion. I want to come back to the authorities and like you mentioned, seditious conspiracy, some of the authorities that are available to prosecute domestic terrorism. But before we get there, just one more thought on sort of how the Justice Department works. If we can back the lens up from NSD and talk about the coordination within the Department of Justice and FBI and the components a little bit more broadly. One of the things that strikes me that's different about the present domestic terror, the way that the Justice Department would approach the current domestic violent extremist and domestic terrorism threat is that it actually involves a much broader array of legal authorities and of DOJ components than we needed to deal with in the international terrorism context. And I was looking back when I was rereading your bio again, Matt, I noticed that you actually started your career in the civil rights division. And in some of the cases, especially the hate crimes issues or the things that involve hate crimes or the white supremacist cases, these types of things, seems to me that this is an area where the National Security Division might be coordinating with the Civil Rights Division, perhaps in a way that it never has before. There's always been a close coordination between NSD and the Criminal Division, some coordination on certain issues with civil, but can you talk a little bit about how at a departmental level, this new threat and this new environment has created more opportunities for collaboration across the department?
Yeah, that's a terrific insight, Carrie, and really critically important. So yes, as you noted, I started my career at the Justice Department some years ago in the Civil Rights Division. Coming back to the department now in this job, one of my first meetings when I first started was with Kristen Clark, the Assistant Attorney General for Civil Rights, and the reason, lots of reasons to have that relationship, but first and foremost is the reality is that when we talk about domestic terrorism, some of the most significant, most heinous domestic terrorism attacks are also hate crimes. And we have charged those cases with the Civil Rights Division in the lead using our very effective hate crime statute. So if you think about Charleston or Pittsburgh or El Paso, all of those attacks were hate crimes and were prosecuted by the Civil Rights Division prosecutors in their criminal section. And we in the National Security Division were playing a supportive role. And in fact, with Buffalo, the attack in Buffalo, that is being, announced yesterday, in fact, by the Attorney General when he went to Buffalo, that is being charged as a hate crime and being handled by the U.S. Attorney's Office in Buffalo, along with the Civil Rights Division. So just to give you some sense, when that happened that weekend, I was in touch, and the National Security Division was immediately in touch with the U.S. Attorney's Office in Buffalo and with our counterparts in the Civil Rights Division, looking at, I think what I would think that your audience would hope and expect. We are one team. We are looking at this heinous attack. What can we do, immediately? How do we coordinate best? What is the right tool to use? We're also, of course, coordinating with state and local authorities because, of course, that was also a state crime and was charged as a state crime in New York. So there's often multiple moving pieces. Our fundamental commitment is that we are going to find the best tool and the best authority to hold perpetrators accountable and bring justice to the victims in these communities. And it is the case that when it comes to domestic terrorism, it is often going to be, particularly when we talk about racially motivated white supremacist violence, it's going to be a Civil Rights Division lead, a civil rights lead charging hate crimes with National Security Division playing a supportive role. But even with Buffalo, that weekend, I was on a conference call with hundreds of stakeholders around the country, joining with Kristen Clark and the U.S. Attorney in Buffalo and the FBI to bring, give what information we could from our perspective. But it was really, the message is that we're one big team here in the Justice Department, and there are going to be tools that we have and authorities we have to bring to bear, and we're just going to figure out which is the right approach in each individual case.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. One of the things as you were describing that, I was just noting some of the shooting events that you mentioned. So Charleston, Pittsburgh, El Paso, Buffalo, those all seem to be events that there was this lone individual who was the perpetrator of those. And so that is this big category of the events that the country is experiencing. Parallel to that, we do have what seems to be a growth and proliferation of groups. And so I want to pause for a minute and shift our conversation a little bit to some of the groups that we're seeing become more visible just across the country. And I worry a little bit that they're almost being mainstreamed somewhat into at least some sect of the political environment. So when we think about I guess my question is, how are you and DOJ thinking about the current crop of domestic violent groups? If we think about like Proud Boys, Oath Keepers, this group Patriot Front, which is the group that was pulled out of a U-Haul a few days ago in Idaho and arrested. In the national security community, I just have this sense that these groups are not taken as seriously as Al-Qaeda and ISIS, the international terrorist groups that we worked for the last 20 years. So my question at a very specific level is, how does DOJ assess the organization, the communications capacity, the resourcing of these groups? Are they more like international terrorist organizations, or are they more like criminal gangs from where you sit?
I think the way I think about this question, and it's an important question, is a couple things. One, it's really important when we talk about the types of criminal activity that we are concerned about when it comes to domestic terrorism, hate crimes, the type of what we see from individuals who carry out attacks. Like that, it's really important. A fundamental distinction is between violence and threats of violence that violate the criminal law, particularly federal law when it comes to the Department of Justice, on the one hand, and First Amendment protected activity, whether that's activity involving speech, activity involving association. It is not against the law to associate with other people who hold extremist or hateful views or abhorrent views. Right. The reality is that is First Amendment protected. It is core to our values as a country that people can hold these viewpoints. They can associate with other people who hold those viewpoints, and that's not against the law. And in fact, we cannot and we do not investigate people based on their views or their associations solely. So that's just a really important point, and it bears emphasis. What we are focused on is when these ideas, these viewpoints, or these associations manifest in some way in an act of violence or a threat of violence. And look, obviously, with you and this very sophisticated audience understand when I say that's easier said than done, right? That line can be hard to find. And hard to draw. Like, when is somebody who's on that path of espousing radical views, extremist views, abhorrent views that we all should be willing to call out, but that are not criminal and are not the basis for an investigation? When does somebody cross over that line? And when can we then open an investigation? Can the FBI predicate an investigation and start to use the tools it has to collect information about it, to collect evidence about that person? That's a tough challenge for the government. And so, I think when we talk about these groups, we aren't going to be investigating groups as groups. This is partly a lesson that we've learned over the course of our history, most sort of starkly in the Church Committee report in the 1970s, right? Where there were abuses by the FBI and the intelligence community of tracking people based on their views or based on their associations. So we've learned that lesson. So how do we then apply that today, right? How do we now, we know that there are individuals and groups who are on that path to becoming violent. We have to rely on our typical law enforcement collection sources, people in the neighborhood, families, others to provide information to us when they see that happening. That's a real challenge. And I can talk more about the nature of that challenge, but the other thing I guess I would say in response to your question about, are we taking them seriously? I mean, look, the way we show that we're taking something seriously is through our court filings and our charging documents, right? So with the Justice Department, when the way that we have taken a a group of individuals seriously is when we've charged them with crimes. We've charged, in the January 6th set of cases, we've charged a group of Proud Boys with seditious conspiracy, a very, very serious, rarely charged crime. We've charged a group of Oath Keepers with seditious conspiracy, very serious crime. So we've made our case in those filings of what our allegations are. We will seek to prove those allegations in court. That's how we will identify the criminal activity that we believe they engaged in, and that's how we will demonstrate the seriousness of purpose that we bring to bear when we see the violence that those groups engaged in.
That's a wonderful explanation of how the Justice Department is thinking of it, and it is very different than the international terrorism context. It's quite different, and brings in so many different aspects of criminal law enforcement to bear to be able to address the domestic threat. I appreciate your articulation of the thinking on the First Amendment. And on one hand, so I thought if we could just dive into that a little bit more. So on one hand, that clearly, I mean, you know, when I watch all the public testimony of national security leaders and FBI Director Wray talk about January 6th or talk about the domestic violence threat, clearly they're within the government, within the Justice Department or FBI, First Amendment is at the forefront of minds in terms of navigating these cases. And so I hear you when you say this is a huge challenge to be able to navigate that. I'm curious how the Justice Department is working with investigators and prosecutors to navigate that, because on one hand, we do have a First Amendment and we're going to respect that, and everybody in law enforcement is going to adhere to the law, and we want to have guidelines and rules, but we also want to have guidelines and rules that reflect where the boundaries actually are. The First Amendment's not a suicide pact. And so are you guys doing anything different in terms of training or policies that or updating the investigative guidelines or anything like that that can help investigators understand what they are and aren't allowed to do? Because some of the stuff that's come out publicly after January 6th, you just get this feeling a little bit that there was a lot of fear about crossing lines on the First Amendment when it comes to investigating from a prevention standpoint.
Yeah, so I think there is some, and I think it's appropriate, right? I know you're not suggesting otherwise, but I think it's appropriate that there's a lot of thought and care given to making sure that we stay on the right side of that line. And in fact, it's exactly in some ways why the National Security Division was created. We have, not only do we have the prosecutors in the counterterrorism section, but we have a large group of prosecutors in our law and policy group that are dedicated and have written papers and looked at these questions and helped provide training and guidance to the FBI to help them discern where is that line between protected First Amendment activity and threats of violence or violence upon which, under the FBI's own guidelines, they can begin to investigate. And as you know, and maybe folks in the audience know, there's sort of this tiering approach to the FBI and how it approaches its investigation, starting with the lowest level of techniques that they can use, the least intrusive techniques based on a minimal amount of predication that moves up the scale to being able to, at the highest level based on probable cause, request search warrants or wiretaps, right? The most intrusive techniques. And it's a very well-established approach. Can it be improved? Absolutely. We're always trying to learn to make it better, to your question, and to be responsive to the nature of the threat as it changes and morphs. But the basic structure is sound. The basic structure of the more predication, the more evidence you have of criminal activity, the more intrusive techniques you can use. I just think, going back to what I said before in our conversation before about the difference between groups, domestic groups and international terrorist organizations, there's just a whole different set of techniques and authorities that apply in the international terrorism context. As well as anybody around, how FISA works, right? Where you can obtain authority to wiretap, to conduct electronic surveillance based on someone's status as an agent of a foreign power. That is different from the domestic context, where we don't collect intelligence against agents of a domestic power, right? There's no such thing, and there's no appetite for that, and that would be contrary, I think, to our basic values. What we do focus on is our law enforcement techniques, which are tried and true, whether we talk about, I was a prosecutor for 12 years here in Washington, and I did organized crime cases and gang cases where we did wiretaps and search warrants. We had sources into those groups. We had a lot of techniques to collect information and evidence against those groups. True when it comes to the mafia or all kinds of public corruption cases. So these are techniques that are tried and true, that work and are effective against individuals and individuals who banded together for the purpose of committing acts of violence. And so I'm very confident in the strength of those tools and those approaches. But look, I will validate your your concern. Are we making sure that we're aggressive enough? And I think that's a role that, as lawyers, it's a role I've played, you've played in the past. How do you give the operators, whether we're talking about FBI agents, NSA operators, CIA officers, within sort of this broad set of people who are involved in national security work, how do you give them, as lawyers, how do you give them an understanding of where that line is, how they can comfortably and confidently use the authorities that Congress and the American people have given us, while also making sure that we are staying on the right side of that line. It's why this work is so fascinating, to be honest, and why it's so challenging. But I think it's incumbent on us as national security lawyers and as leaders to provide that level of guidance and confidence to the people who are on the front lines in protecting the country.
Right. And this, just to provide a little bit of context for our viewers, this goes to the prevention piece, right? So the investigative piece, criminal authorities can be used to help disrupt a potential act of violence or potential act of domestic terrorism. And so on that prevention piece, it is interesting, though, Matt, to hear you talk about the intelligence side of it. Obviously, NSD plays sort of a unique role in the Justice Department in that you are the sort of connective tissue to the intelligence community, and you had your former hat as the National Counterterrorism Director. There is, particularly in the after reviews of January 6, 2021 attack on the Capitol, there is a little bit of in the public dialogue, a remaining question about what the role of intelligence should have been. And so I guess my question is the US government doesn't collect using the same authorities against these domestic groups the same way that it does against international terrorism groups, but there is some intelligence collection that could be in information obtained from state and locals, information that's obtained from complainants. There is an intelligence role. So can you talk a little bit about how, whether it's intelligence coming from the FBI or from state and locals or coming from DHS, intelligence and analysis, can you talk a little bit, though, about how the intelligence and warning system should work in the domestic terrorism context?
Yeah, that's a great point. And ideally, you hit on it, ideally, you have this community of FBI at the federal level, FBI and DHS in particular, and at the state and local level, you have multiple times more first responders and police and firefighters who are often going to be the first set of law enforcement to be confronted with somebody who's is moving toward violence. And then you have the even broader ecosystem of teachers, religious leaders, social workers, sort of community oriented folks who are also going to be in a position. So ideally, you want all that information to flow in a sort of a trusted environment. The other key piece is social media. Also, a lot of this information is publicly available, right? What we see in terms of people's talking about moving toward violence or actually involved in inciting violence. A lot of that's taking place out in the open in social media, on social media channels. The challenge is it's a lot of information. How do you focus it? What are the authorities to see and obtain that information? Some of those authorities are lodged within the Department of Homeland Security, and our friend Ken Weinstein was just confirmed last week as the head of intelligence and analysis, and this is going to be front and center in terms of, for him, I think, and along with the FBI field offices, and a key construct there, as folks may know, is the Joint Terrorism Task Forces, which were stood up post 9/11, but these task forces include federal officers as well as state and local officers, and the goal being to meld together that ecosystem in one field office, task force, to make sure that information flows and is investigated appropriately.
Let me ask you a follow-up.
Yeah,
we got a question from the audience that's on the topic of social media, which you mentioned a moment ago. So the question was, what role should the DOJ, or I'll ask you, what role does DOJ play in collaboration or coordination or in dialogue with private technology and information companies to curb the rise of domestic terrorism? Can you talk a little bit about those partnership and those dialogues that take place?
Yeah, so there's a couple levels at which that relationship takes place. One is informal. Are there relationships established for companies, whether social media companies or other types of companies, to provide information to the government when they see something that concerns them in terms of violating their own terms of service or otherwise is alarming? Certainly, you see that in the context of child exploitation, right? That's a well-established relationship between the government and companies that are social media platforms. But that also spills over into other forms of public safety, including domestic terrorism or potential violence. So that's one level, those sort of relationships that are really important. The other, though, and I'll speak to this with some degree of firsthand knowledge. Before I came back to government, I spent 3 years at Uber as the Chief Trust and Security Officer at Uber. And one of the teams that I oversaw was the law enforcement response team. And as you would expect, Uber, like a lot of companies in the technology space, has a lot of data that could be of interest to law enforcement. So we had strong working relationships at the federal level, but also with state and local police departments who were often issuing subpoenas, in some cases search warrants, depending on our rules, to obtain information. So there's the point being, beyond the relationship, collaboration, there's the standard compulsory process, which is a way for the government, the federal government, the Department of Justice in particular plays a role there, right? Through federal prosecutors and the FBI in issuing process to, whether we're talking about telecommunications companies or social media platforms or rideshare companies, right? The whole range of companies that could have information that could break a case open because you have been able to collect that key piece of data. And look, I'll say this from my own experience, it was really important for us in my private sector world to have those strong relationships with the police and departments around the country, really around the world, right. Where there's rule of law, regimes in place. So it's a big challenge to the question. It's not like, I'm not trying to give it short shrift, because it's a very the terrain is really complicated, and there's different levels of cooperation by different companies, for sure, and that's part of the challenge too. But it is a key part of the solution as we try to understand the nature of the threat.
In our remaining time, this has been great, Matt. Thank you for all of your insights. In our remaining few minutes here, let's turn to authorities. And you mentioned early on in the conversation, we've seen the use of seditious conspiracy used in the January 6th cases, which to my mind, I think it right after the attack on the Capitol, that was the first statute that I was looking back at, thinking about how that would potentially be used. And so now, as the Justice Department has continued its extensive investigations. We see those seditious conspiracy charges coming out. We've talked about the hate crimes laws that are available. And so the Justice Department really has demonstrated that it has taken a fresh look at all the different authorities that potentially are available to prosecute these types of cases. And then one would presume investigate. That provides the basis to be able to investigate in a proactive way. My question is on domestic terrorism, do you have the authorities you need to do your job?
Yeah, so the answer is yes. We basically have the authorities we need. I think we've sort of shown that with how we've responded to the threats over the past several years. We have the criminal statutes in terms of substantive criminal law, seditious conspiracy, obstruction, the hate crime statutes. Those federal laws in combination with state laws provide, from a substantive criminal law perspective, the range of authorities I think that are sufficient to meet the task. There are some areas where we've looked at potentially tweaking some of those statutes and we've had some internal conversations about proposals along those lines. But generally speaking, on the substantive criminal law, we're in good shape. And I think similarly on the process side, the ability to get search warrants, the ability to issue process, to compel the provision of data. We also have pretty well established, tried and true methods of getting the information we need. So I think we're in okay shape. I do. Like I will say this: there's the nature of the threat is particularly challenging, and I think this is a little bit. I think this is responsive to your question about authorities. And the reason I say it's particularly challenging is what we are talking about are individuals alone, sometimes, like I said, individuals acting alone or in very small cells who meet secretly, covertly. They don't communicate using open channels. They're often using encryption. So our opportunity to see what they're doing and understand what they're doing before they act is limited. You're
going to give me an opportunity here at the end, Matt, to ask if we are living going dark.
Right. So there's the encryption problem. And there is also the problem of they choose soft targets, as we've seen: schools, shopping malls, shopping centers, places of worship. We cannot defend those places, nor do we want to create, I think, as a country, hardened locations where we all meet, in our lives. And then third, and importantly, is the ease of access to military grade weapons. Right. And as long as you have people who can communicate secretly, who pick soft targets, who have access to high-powered weapons, we are going to have attacks that often inflict harm on a mass scale. And that is a challenge, just the reality of the challenge that we face in law enforcement today.
Well, I'm going to thank you for that last point. I heard you when you said it with our friends at George Washington's Program on Extremism yesterday at their symposium. I'm really glad that you are concluding our conversation with that point, because in the national security community, we don't often hear our national security leaders talk about the availability of weapons of war as something that is a threat to Americans and a threat to law enforcement. The proliferation Correct. Of these weapons, in my view, makes law enforcement's job so much harder, so much more dangerous. And so I'm just really grateful for you in your leadership role that you are so open and clear about that point.
Great. No, it's an absolutely, I think, indisputable fact. So yeah, and you're right. It does create harm or risk to not just the community, but to law enforcement as well.
Right. Well, listen, Matt Olsen, Assistant Attorney General for National Security, friend of CNAS and longtime friend, thank you for joining me for this Safe at Home conversation. We're so grateful for your knowledge, for your experience, and for your continued willingness and enthusiasm about serving in public service. So thanks, Matt, and we'll be in touch soon. Thanks for joining us. And for all of you, thank you for joining our conference edition of Safe at Home. And we appreciate you sticking with us for future sessions for the rest of the day.
Thank you.